in our next module, this one's kind of interesting. In our next module, what we're going to do is we're going to make an availability group fail on purpose. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the whole tour in screenshots, because when I do this in real life with a real availability group, I experience weird kinds of failures that I'm not really trying to teach you. I want to teach you what happens in one specific AlwaysOn availability group issue. And I want to have slides here to kind of simulate how quick timing goes in the real world. I'm going to assume that you're the database administrator, or I'm the database administrator, and I kind of sort of know how my availability group works. Let me show you what my availability group is. I have a simple 2-node AG, ToonSys01 and ToonSys02, that are in two different subnets. I'm sorry, in one subnet. So like I'm keeping everything inside the same data center, and I'm doing synchronous writes between them to make sure that every time that I do an insert on ToonSys01, it's written over to ToonSys02. Super simple, the new version of Windows, a decently new version of SQL Server. Everything I'm going to show you is the same in SQL 2014, 16, 12, and vNext. Just as a quick refresher, the availability group is a group of databases that move around. The listener name is the virtual computer name that points around to whichever one happens to be the primary right now. We haven't talked too much about listeners yet, but listener is a virtual computer name that you set up at the time that you're setting up your listener. This is the name that everyone points to for their applications, like Virtual SQL 04. Here's how my availability group looks in Object Explorer details. If I right-click on my availability group and go into Properties in SSMS, right now, my ToonSys02 is the primary. Everything shows as healthy. Both nodes are synchronized with no data loss. Now, I'm kind of letting you cheat here. I'm showing you exactly what the AG looked like before its moment of failure. Most people don't get that luxury. If I asked you right now, write down all of your AGs and which node is the primary in that AG, and can you lose data? Most people are going to have a hard time doing that, but I'll let you cheat. Mark your clocks. It's 48 minutes after the hour, and I just got a phone call. I got a phone call from the help desk saying, are you doing anything on the primary SQL server right now? Is there anything going on with the availability group? Because we're not able to get in. I fire open SQL Server Management Studio, and I go to connect to the listener, ToonSys Listen, because I want to go connect to the same exact thing that my end users are connecting to. And after 30 seconds, I get a timeout. The listener is down. This is the thing that apps are connecting to. Because I'm a database administrator, I know my server names by heart, and I know that this AG runs on ToonSys01 and ToonSys02. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go connect, and I can't connect to ToonSys01. It times out. But ToonSys02, I can connect to by name. Notice how it says availability groups resolving, and it shows that the databases are not synchronizing. I like resolving. It's a wonderful name. It suggests that it's resolving to do better next year. So what I'm going to do is right-click on that resolving and say, show me the dashboard. What's going on in this availability group right now? Well, the availability group is critical, and all I have for a list here is ToonSys02, and that's it. It doesn't show ToonSys01, and it says not synchronizing. Okay, so gut check. The application is indeed down. The databases are there, but in the real world, I don't know who was the primary before the failure happened. If I have the luxury of some time, I may go look at my canary table and say, attention to the boss, I do have data as of a certain date. I need to do additional troubleshooting though, because right now I can't force the availability group online yet. Let's go look in the error log. So in the error log, I see a bunch of thrashing back and forth here, waiting local, waiting local. And if I zoom in a little bit in here, it says, waiting for local Windows Server failover clustering to come online. But this is an informational message only, and no user action is required. Go Windows, yay! That's what I'll just do. I'll tell my management that it's an informational message only. No user action is required. I'm going back to the golf course. I never go golfing. I don't know why I said that. I've gone mini golfing, but that's about it. Now, if you're the kind of company where the Windows team is separate, this is the point where you would punt the ticket over to the Windows team and say, call me when the cluster starts. But unfortunately, we're not in one of those companies, and here I am also the Windows team. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go remote desktop into ToonSys 02. Just during an emergency, I like troubleshooting directly from the cluster node because it can help me detect things like connectivity problems quicker. So I'm going to go remote desktop into ToonSys 02, and then I'm going to fire open Failover Cluster Manager. Failover Cluster Manager will show me what's happening on this cluster right now, except that after 30 seconds, this operation has failed. Which makes sense because when the cluster is down, it's usually because ToonSys 02 can't talk to ToonSys 01. If the cluster service won't even start, I probably have operating system problems. I say if ToonSys 01 can't even start, ToonSys 02's cluster service won't even start. Now, I'm probably going to tap a buddy of mine on the shoulder and say, I need you to go look into ToonSys 01. I don't know what's going on in there, but he's not started up. You may need to go remote console him. I'm going to dig deeper into ToonSys 02 for right now. To dig deeper into ToonSys 02, I'm going to go look at the event log. And when the box is having problems this big, I like starting back further. I like starting back at the system level. So I'm going to go into the system event log, and the cluster service terminated unexpectedly. It's done this 5 times. After 60 seconds, it's going to restart the service. And the reason why it can't start, it says ToonSys 02 couldn't join the cluster because it failed to communicate over the network with any other node in the cluster. If I go look at the services control panel and I go see what's going on with ToonSys 02's cluster service, as I'm watching it, it'll say running for 5 seconds, then it'll cycle itself back off. Windows is continuously firing up this service and trying to talk over to ToonSys 01. Now, when I'm doing this in real life, if you check your clocks, it's been about 5 minutes, and all I'm doing is ripping through screenshots fairly quickly. Let's now go in and see, are we able to talk to ToonSys 01 yet? And pings are still timing out. I don't know why. I don't know why ToonSys 01 is down, and I don't know why voting isn't quite working the way I would want it to. My guess is that whoever built this cluster, maybe me, didn't quite configure quorum the way he was supposed to. Or maybe their shared disk and ToonSys 01 owned that disk at the time. So I'm going to try and change my cluster configuration settings. Luckily for me, in SQL Server Management Studio, I can see this in the SSMS without going into Windows. Except I can't when the cluster's down. Hopefully, you documented all of your cluster quorum settings before when you built the cluster, but dirty secret, most of us do not. So if I can't do it in SSMS, can I do it from Windows? There's a set of PowerShell commands that I can use. Set cluster quorum, node and file share majority, go point your cluster witness over here. But no matter how many times I run it, it won't let me edit anything on the cluster until the cluster starts. I have to be able to get the cluster to start before I can change it. Which sounds kind of backwards. I can't get it to start because something's broken. I don't know whether it's ToonSys 01 or whether it's my quorum settings. So now's another moment where you look at your clock. It's been 7 minutes, and I want you to pretend like you're frantically searching Google for, say, 90 seconds. And then you come across this page in Books Online, How to Force a Cluster Start without having enough voters for quorum. And it gives you a list of commands that you're going to go run. Stop the cluster node, start it with this fix quorum command, then give yourself a vote, and then list out whoever else has votes. This is kind of how I approach to work with PowerShell is I will go Google and find the commands that I need and go run them. Except they don't work. This is the life of a consultant. Things that often say they'll work in books online don't really actually work. The only way this set of commands in books online works is if you manually go into the services control panel and stop the cluster service yourself. This way it'll stop thrashing. Otherwise, Windows is going to start trying to restart this service continuously, and you won't be able to get in to make changes at the rate that you want to make them. So if I go into the cluster services and I just right-click and say stop, now I can go in and make the changes that I want. No red errors. It just says start the cluster name with fix quorum. Here it shows ToonSys02 is in and he's joining. I'm going to give ToonSys02 a vote myself and then go list out for me everyone in the cluster and who has votes. Notice that it shows ToonSys01 is down. He still has a vote, guessing that this is how it looked before my cluster died. But at least now I can go into Failover Cluster Manager and start monkeying around and making changes. From ToonSys02, if I go open up the cluster configurator, cluster manager, now, yes, granted, I know I have warnings and errors going on inside here, but at least the cluster's up. Now the listener still isn't working yet. The listener's still out. If I go look in a Failover Cluster Manager, there's a role for the listener, for my whole entire availability group, and it says my availability group has failed. So let's just try starting it. Just right-click on the cluster or right-click on the AG and click Start Role. And after a matter of seconds, it just immediately fails again. All right, so in panic freakout mode, if I'm looking at the list of voters in my cluster, I don't have a majority. I only have one voter who's up and running out of two. Maybe I have a quorum problem. Tell you what, let's go add ourselves a witness so that way I'm going to have a majority of voters up and running. I'm going to go to the same exact place that I talked about in the last module. I'm going to click on More Actions in Failover Cluster Manager, and I'm going to go click Configure Cluster Quorum Settings. Instead of just going to Quorum Witness, I'm just going to click Advanced, and I'm going to start taking away votes from ToonSys01. He's down, so I don't want to bother having him have a vote. Let's just uncheck the vote for ToonSys01 for now, and then let's come back later and let's add ourselves a witness. This will at least get us past the awkward position of not having enough voters. Windows warns us, hey buddy, you really should think about creating a witness right now. I know, I just don't know where I'm going to put it yet. My AG is down. It's been 10 minutes, 11 minutes. So after I hit next, this window just stays here for about 60 seconds, and you don't know whether you're supposed to click finish or not, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the whole thing just fills in for you. Oh God, this is not the confidence level I need right now. I'm going to go ahead and run into Failover Cluster Manager, and if I look at the nodes, now it shows ToonSys02 and ToonSys01. ToonSys02 is up and has a vote. ToonSys01 is down. All right, give me my availability group. I just need the availability group back up. I'm going to go over into roles, which is where it lists all my stuff, and then AG, start role, and it fails again. If I go into SQL Server Management Studio and I go look at my databases, I still cannot query my databases. If I go a little further into SQL Server's event logs, it says the availability group cannot become the primary. Wait a minute. This replica cannot become the primary because this cluster was started in force quorum mode. Consider performing a forced manual failover with possible data loss. Wait a minute, you guys remember when I was looking at my AG, who was the primary all along? ToonSys02. This looks like a terrifying command, force online with allowed data loss. Are you kidding me? Well, I fixed quorum. I don't have a quorum problem anymore. I have just one voter. What am I supposed to do here? I've always was the primary. I just need to bring him back online. Well, this is documented in books online as expected behavior. Whenever you start the cluster with fixed quorum, the only way to get things back to normal is either to restart the cluster, which can be terrifying to do under duress like this, especially if you have multiple things in the cluster that are all trying to run at once. And if you have an AG, the other way you can do this is perform a forced failover with allowed data loss, even though you're not going to lose data. All right, we're at 14 minutes in. My SQL server's still down. I need to do it. Let's do it in the easiest, safest way possible. Let's use the GUI. In SQL Server Management Studio, isn't that funny to hear somebody say the safest way possible, use the GUI? But when you're doing something you've never done before, when you're troubleshooting an AG like this, you just want to use something that's supposed to work really well. I go into ToonSys02, I right-click on the AG and go Failover. Quorum status is, what? This is why I get nervous about the GUI. No, it's certainly not normal quorum right now, but okay, whatever. It only lets me pick ToonSys02 because it's the only replica that's allowed to fail over right now. I do like that it shows failover readiness, no data loss, because that's correct. This guy was the primary before. I just can never really be sure about what parts of books online or what parts of the GUI I can actually believe, because you can believe this part, but you can't believe this part. That's kind of sketchy. All right, fine, whatever. I'm just going to click next, and it errors out. Zooming in at the error message. The AG cannot become the primary because this thing was started in forced quorum mode. Consider performing a forced manual failover with possible data loss. Well, you told me I didn't have any data loss. You gave me a GUI I could click. All I had to do was click the next button. If I needed to do it with forced allowed data loss, why didn't you let me? All right, whatever. I'm just going to open up a new window, and I'm going to type alter availability group, force failover allowed data loss. Command completed successfully. And now when I go into my availability group dashboard, now at least I have ToonSys02 up and running here. It does show me as the primary. So now suddenly people can start to connect. And if I go into Failover Cluster Manager, it shows that the availability group is up and running. This isn't great. I've got the cluster up. I've got the availability group up. I've got the listener up. Check your clocks. It's 16 minutes since we started this exercise, and all I was doing was ripping through screenshots at a pretty fast clip. I didn't leave any time aside for status updates, the CIO tapping you on the shoulder, going down the wrong rabbit hole, just going fairly quickly through what looked like it was intuitive. And if I lose this SQL server, I'm boned. I haven't done anything about the backup jobs. I don't know where things are supposed to be running right now. Heaven forbid if I have CheckDB issues, you name it. What happened was that ToonSys02 was always the primary. He was the primary the whole time. But ToonSys01 blew chunks, and for some reason, the whole entire cluster came down. The cluster kept trying to come back up, but couldn't on its own. So we had to force the cluster online and alter the AG with force failover allowed data loss, which can be terrifying, even though we didn't lose any data. It's just a terrifying command to go run. So why did cluster quorum fail? I'm running Windows Server 2012 R2, which should have given me both dynamic quorum and dynamic witness. These should prevent exactly the scenario we had here. However, there was no witness configured ahead of time. And The availability group was on Toonsys 02. Both Toonsys 02 and Toonsys 01 are involved in this, but they don't both have votes. Just because Toonsys 02 is the owner of the availability group does not mean he's the one with the vote. This is by design. The person or the node who I think of all my SQL servers as people, drunken fools who refuse to listen, but at least they listen to all the wrong terms. Toonsys 02 and Toonsys 01 both were eligible for votes, but Windows picks which one happens to have the vote at any given time. Toonsys 01 happened to have the vote, and then when Toonsys 01 lost his network connection or suffered a hard crash, Windows can't reassign the vote fast enough. It's easy for us to think that whoever's the primary in the AG should also have the vote. However, you can have multiple AGs. You can have multiple services running above and beyond just the SQL Server listener. Otherwise, whenever Toonsys 01 dies, we are bang out of luck. All right, we got far enough in here. Toonsys 01 is eventually, we're going to go troubleshoot him. We're going to fix his broken Windows, his network adapter, whatever it was that caused him to blue screen of death. We're going to resuscitate him, bring him back to life. And then when he comes back up, in theory, he's supposed to automatically pull all of the changes from Toonsys 02. See, I've been away for hours. I've been troubleshooting like crazy on Toonsys 01. I come back much later, and then I look at AlwaysOn dashboard. On the left side in Object Explorer, Toonsys 02 says synchronized. On the right side in Object Explorer Details, over on the availability group dashboard, it says Toonsys 01 not synchronizing. Synchronized? Not synchronizing. This is also by design. When you're looking at Object Explorer refers to the SQL Server itself. If I'm looking at Toonsys 02, synchronized really just means he's the primary. Yeah, I'm synchronized with whoever's the primary. Who's the primary? I am. What? That doesn't make any sense. Then if I look at Toonsys 01's Object Explorer, that would tell a different story. It says not synchronized. Now, why isn't it synchronized? When I go in and look at the Failover Cluster Manager, it'll show me who's in the availability group and who is not. Just because Toonsys 01 starts up doesn't mean he always joins the availability group instantly right away. If after a few minutes, I'll see that he does join back in, but his availability group synchronization does not keep flowing. No matter how long I wait, if I just wait and watch while these two servers are doing their thing, they are never going to heal themselves normally until something happens, like until I do a whole bunch of restarts and failovers back to back, or I go fix the data flow myself. Why this is really dangerous is on Toonsys 02, my transaction log volume is just getting bigger and bigger because SQL Server has to be able to push all of the data from Toonsys 02's transaction log over to Toonsys 01. Whenever I do a force failover with allowed data loss, SQL Server says, we're not synchronizing anything from here on out. You chose to bring someone on. I may need to get the data from the other database. Well, you may need to get the data from the other database to do any kind of postmortem type work. In order to get transactions to flow through again, what you need to do is go run alter database, set header, resume. Now, you have to do this for every database on every replica. Now, when I did it, it doesn't show anything as getting better because I was running it on the listener. It's normal to run your availability group commands on the listener because we usually just think of the listener as the place we need to go communicate. But when I'm forcing data to start flowing through again, I actually need to run this on every replica that's involved to say, yes, start sending database transactions through from the primary. What's hilarious to me is that command said it succeeded, but it was on the primary. There's no one to synchronize to on the primary. You should have thrown me back an error and said that, hey, you need to go run this command somewhere else. If I go run it successfully over on the other SQL server, TuneSys01, instead of over on the listener, it again completed successfully. And now, at least when I go into my availability group dashboard, things catch up. This is one of those reasons why we say that AlwaysOn Availability Groups synchronous does not guarantee zero data loss. Replicas can restart, transactions can fail to go through from one SQL server to the other. It doesn't mean zero data loss guaranteed. It just means that when they're synchronized, you won't likely lose data. All right, so after this emergency, after I lost TuneSys01, troubleshooted him, brought him back, I still need to figure out what I'm going to do for quorum. I need to set up some kind of file share witness. I need to check my transaction logs, make sure, see why things failed, test failovers back and forth, all kinds of things that I need to do as a postmortem there. This is why when I want to build these things out, I want to test planned, unplanned, and planned failback failovers all before going live with this thing so that I know how things are going to break and I have it all scripted out ahead of time to know how things are going to break. There's also the interesting possibility of what if two replicas are both writable at the same time? Here, we went split brain and both replicas stepped back. Neither one of them would be the primary. Now, in the next module, I'm going to talk about what happens when they both step forward, when they're both writable at the same time. Whew. So what did we learn out of this module? First off, in terms of triaging availability groups, I showed something that is extremely simple and straightforward. A two-node availability group, both in the same subnet, nothing very hard at all. Only one AG. I didn't even have multiple AGs inside here, or agent jobs that we had to fail over back and forth. Your Windows version matters a lot. Windows Server 2012 R2 is way better than either 2012 or 2008 R2. There's been a ton of cluster hotfixes in there. Highly recommend getting on that one. The question of whether or not you should get onto Win 2016 is a tougher question. I actually don't have any clients using Windows Server 2016 today. Most of the folks that I work with say, we're going to wait until, say, service packs and books start to come out on this thing, because Windows Server 2012 works fairly well. You see me bashing some oddball behavior in here, but everything that I bash in here, the same exact stuff still takes place in Windows Server 2016. In order to reduce your lists of failures, go through and make sure that you have redundant network connections out between every pair of cluster nodes. Make sure that you screenshot and test everything so you know how it's going to react when stuff explodes. And then extensive monitoring is required for AlwaysOn availability groups. I need to know that the listener's up, that network connectivity works, when the file share witness bombs out. I'm going to talk about later in another module which monitoring products we recommend and why. I used to think before I was an MCM, I thought, they Microsoft certified masters, they probably roll their own monitoring, they use their own perfmon scripts. No, man, every year that goes by, I am more and more convinced that you should be using somebody's third-party monitoring utility. You don't want to try to catch all the possible ways this stuff can fail. You just can't keep up with it. The availability groups dashboard is a nice start, but it's only current state. It doesn't show you everything that happened leading up to the moment of disaster. In our scenario here, I let you cheat and look at TuneSys02. In real life, you would want a monitoring tool that lets you jump back to a point in time and see, all right, Tuesday at 1 p.m. before the outage hit, who was the primary? How far back was he? If you had something like that, you'd be much more confident in running that force failover with allow data loss command on TuneSys02. And then basically whenever I look at triaging a first responder in an availability group, is it online? What was my status like right before the failover? Is the cluster healthy? If the cluster isn't even healthy, punt it back over to the Windows group. One of the things I love about large enterprises where there's a specialized Windows group that just specializes in failover clustering. Whenever you run AlwaysOn Availability, did I skip one? No, okay, there's one more I got to hit later. Everything that I talk through in here, even just ripping through screenshots at high speed, that was 15, 16 minutes of time. You think about the time it takes for a human being to get sober and get up to a keyboard and start the VPN command. It's normal when I lose a cluster to see a human being take at least 30 minutes in order to bring the cluster back up and running online. That's really if they're well rehearsed and working off a checklist. If they're not working off a checklist and well rehearsed, imagine what's going to happen when some meatbag runs alter database or availability group, force failover with allow data loss. You're going to force the wrong replica online and lose data. This is also why I like having a staging environment. Staging is like the DBA's development environment. This is an environment that has the same availability group, failover cluster, log shipping that you're going to have over in production. And this is where you go test your failovers back and forth. You do screenshots, making sure everyone's confident and well rehearsed. If you do that in a development environment, you're going to be constantly breaking their development environment, and the developers will hate your guts. There's one piece that should always take time. That command, force failover with allow data loss, that should always have multiple people involved just as a sign off that, are we all really sure that the command we're about to run actually makes sense? AlwaysOn Availability Groups looks really easy on the brochure. It's the when you test it and fail it over back and forth, not just in a planned scenario, but an unplanned scenario. That's where people start to discover how incredibly complex this is. Because unlike database mirroring or log shipping or anything like that, when the AG goes down, everything's down. There is no plan B.